Starlight pooled on the leaves above the Elven Treehouse like a quiet tide, settling into the hollows of leaf and bark and spilling thin fingers down the woven sides until the whole place seemed stitched to the night. The canopy breathed in a slow, almost imperceptible rhythm. Sap breath, the keeper thought as she moved. An inhalation and soft sigh that tilted the ladder rung and made the rimboard flex like a chest. Light threaded through layers of green and silver. Where the leaves overlapped it broke into a scatter of pinpricks, and, where a hole had been patched with a darker tissue of leaf silk, the starlight read the seam differently, as if the sky itself were admiring the mending. Lirien, who had kept this house in the upper boughs for 3 generations of apprentices, moved with a choreography that belonged to weather and wood. Her hands carried memory, the flat, cool weight of a bark plane pressed to a plank, the weary loop of a needle peg between thumb and forefinger, the particular way the glow goblet at the gate took on a green shimmer when the moss beneath it was freshly wetted. She smoothed a folded bough blanket on the little sleeping shelf, tucking the corner with a practiced, slow exactness, then reached to the rimboard where a faint warp had caught her eye earlier that evening. Her fingers traced the grain as if listening. The wood hummed back, a low, satisfied tone when she found the trouble. The treehouse lived by small rituals. The glaze of resin on the banister was renewed every fortnight to keep the sap from creeping in and slurring the join. A handful of glow caps were set to the west so returning neighbors could find the ladder when mist rose. The woven leaf veil at the inner doorway was counted and tightened in the turning of the moon. Tonight, 2 small faults enough to ruffle that ritual presented themselves. One obvious, the other hiding until the wood sighed its complaint. A strip of the bark drape where the children liked to peer had frayed into a tear the size of a palm, and a rimboard plank, cupped by a slow summer rain, had begun to lift at one edge. Each alone might wait. Together, they were an invitation the treehouse could not refuse. By habit and village law of a sort older than any written line, invitations were answered with hands. So Lirien set out a low bowl glow, not yet lit, and began to make a place for what must come. Tools gathered from their usual nests, strips of dyed bark in the small wooden crate beneath the window, an armful of leaf silk she had kept for just such a night. She made the arrangements gently, as though laying a table for an old friend, laying the bark plane on the cloth, the tapping stone beside it, a coil of waxed thread unfurled like a sleeping snail. If you would like to stay a while beneath these leaves, linger with us and listen to the stitch of wood against wood, the narrator said, as a soft courtesy in the way a house offers a hearth. There was no hurry in that invitation. The night had time enough, and the work would reward those who moved with patience. They arrived as they always did. Not all at once, but in a manner that admitted the sky and left the branches to rearrange themselves. First came Halen, the arbor mender, whose hands smelled of warm wood, and who walked as if he kept a plane tucked under his sleeve. He carried a rib of heartwood bound in an old strip of bark. "Light enough to bend, true enough to bear," he said, setting it down with a gentleness that seemed to match the rapture of Starlight. Next, Mira, the grove tender, came with a cloth pouch of preserved fruit, honeyed jellies wrapped in leaf, with a sprig of winter green tucked into the fold, the aroma of it bright and fastening the air with its tang. The apprentices followed, 2 young wardens with bright, uncalloused fingers. Sorrel, who favored leaf silk dyeing and delighted in color that read differently under the glow goblets, and Bram, whose curiosity for joinery often overran his patience, but whose corrections, when taken, yielded a sudden, clear improvement. Elder Aaron arrived last, moving with a small box of oddments balanced against her hip. Spare moon-metal rings, strips of cured resin, a length of finger guard woven from reed. Her voice smaller than anyone's, but carrying, when she chose to use it, the ring of an old bell. She liked to say she kept the village's memory of small things. A lynx-like companion, a forest familiar called Moth, threaded between ankles and leapt into a low window, tail flicking, and eyes aglow with reflected starlight. They made a ring around the bowl glow and spoke with the soft politeness of people who make space for one another's skill. Each set down what they carried as if it were a small gift. Bark for mending, a length of dyed thread, a wedge of sap wax. Conversation, when it came, was little more than a few bars of music. Short phrases, an exchange of tools, a murmur of instruction. Moss bread, Mira offered, handing a slice to Lirien. For the cold hands. "Thank you," Lirien said, and the exchange was done. Small acts like this seeded the night's work. Tea was ladled from a moonstone kettle. The warm liquid smelled of root and spice and soothed fingers before they took to the needle. The glow goblet was lit at a low flame so its light pooled in a shallow golden dish and did not chase the stars away. They sat as if on a common rhythm, passing the tools and the tasks in a flowing manner, apprenticeship braided into labor. There was no pomp to the arrangement. No single person called themselves master. Instead, the work unfolded as a lesson in attention. Halen set the heartwood rib along the cupped plank and tapped it gently, using the tapping stone with a measured patience. "If it hates the bend, cajole it," he said to Bram, whose jaw worked with concentration. "You'll force it. You'll hear the grain protest." Bram tried. Breath held, and then relaxed when the wood took. He learned the same way all apprentices learn under Lirien's roof, by letting their hands listen and by having the courage to make small mistakes that get mended by the touch of an older one. Halen placed his hands over the boys and corrected the angle of the plane. The board yielded with a soft, hushed friction. Wood shavings lay like pale curls in the glow. "See how it curls away," Halen murmured, passing the plane. "Not to take, only to shape." Sorrel, meanwhile, sat with the torn edge of the woven leaf veil in her lap, the frayed fibers catching the bowl glow and throwing back a listless shine. She tried a stitch and hesitated, fingers unsure. Lirien came to her side and positioned a finger guard on her thumb, showed the loop of waxed thread through the eye of the needle peg. Her words were short, deliberate. "Stitch so the light can read the seam," she said. "Stitch so the seam is a poem." Sorrel did as she was shown, and the thread moved in a neat, visible running stitch. They chose to make the mend plainly. The patch would not be hidden. "We leave our marks," Elder Aaron said, smiling into the small circle of faces. "They tell the story if anyone cares to look." Stories were a form of material in the treehouse. As hands worked, voices unfolded an old mend. Aaron told of a night when wind took a chunk of the southern bark drape, and the village stitched a map into the repair so travelers who came after could find the sheltered route. "We used strips of blue lichen," she said, "so that when the lichen dried, it made a pattern like sky moss." The children cross-checked it with the stars and learned their first constellations. The apprentices listened. The story itself was a kind of instruction. How to make a useful aesthetic. How to think of stitches as language. They selected materials with an unusual care. The strip for the tear was not only color but character. A length of bark silk dyed with elderberries for depth, but with one side rubbed to let the stars find their way through. They argued softly about which rib of heartwood would best bear the plank's duty, holding pieces up to the glow to see how the light caught the grain. Choices were not made with words alone, but by running palms along edges. Who could tell better than anyone what a piece would become by touch? At some point, between the passing of a bowl and the filling of a spool, the weather altered its tone. Leaf mist folded in from the lower hollows, a humidity that made the glow goblet halo a little thicker, and the sap breath deeper and sweeter. The tree seemed to draw the mist into itself like a draught, and in response its joints creaked the faint, language-like creaks of a living thing adjusting. The starlight through the leaves softened, turning from bright pins to a scattered veil, as if someone had shaken down a scatter of silver dust. With the mist came a new footstep on the approach, not heavy nor fleet, just a measured tread that paused at the bottom of the ladder. The gate stem where the glow goblet hung stirred as if to rise, and Moth's ears turned as if to read a distant bell. A wayfarer. No more than that by the time they reached the rim, a traveler wrapped in a cloak of spun lichen, face rimed faintly with dew, lifted their head and peered up with an expression that belonged more to someone relieved to have found a harbor than to someone who had dared a trespass. The gate stirred, Lirien said, and rose to lift the woven leaf veil wide with a hand that had an art to it. Her voice, when she spoke to the traveler, was a small, careful thing. "You are welcome. The house has room." The traveler's manner was quiet and grateful. "Storm on the low road," they said, choosing words that did not hint at danger but explained the lateness. "I saw the glow caps. May I rest?" They were offered a seat and a warm cup without ceremony. The apprentices set about arranging a small bed made of folded moss and bough blankets, lifting it into a nook where the traveler could sleep but the house could watch over them. Mira laid out a little of her preserved fruit and a slice of moss bread on a leaf plate. The stranger ate slowly, not so much from hunger as from the need to partake in the domestic continuity that knitting a house together offered. In the meantime, work went on. Halen and Bram took the warped plank from the rimboard and leaned it on the banister, examining its curve. Halen demonstrated how to plane the edge so the rib would sit without crowding the join. Bram, fingers steady now, rasped the grain until the curve was even, learning by the slight patience of his own breath. Sparks of sap occasionally caught the tapping stone and thwopped softly. The sound was a kind of punctuation that joined the creak of the tree. Lirien and Sorrel worked on the veil. They decided that the patch would be visible, an assertion rather than a concealment. The visible stitch would not be merely repair, it would be a small composition, 3 running lines that caught the glow in 3 different ways. "Make the middle row tighter," Lirien advised, "so the light pools there." Sorrel's fingers found steadiness, the needle peg moving like a metronome. Moth wound himself into her lap, fur warm, and purred the low, clarifying note that suggested everything was as it should be. Elder Erin, whose hands were not so nimble as they once had been, sat where she could survey the room, and drew forth from her box a small, flat stone. This was not an ordinary stone, but one smoothed by many hands into the exact shape of an hour. "We used this in the old days," she remarked, placing it beside the bowl glow, "to remind the mender that haste breaks more than time does. Let the stone sit where you can see it when your hands grow tired." The apprentices lent their ears to stories more than to lecture. Sorrel asked about dyeing leaf silk, so it kept the night's hue without bleeding in rain. Bram wanted to know why some joints creaked longer than others. Aaron answered with aphorisms as gentle as they were instructive. Color remembers the cup it first met. If you set it in salt, it will keep a salted taste. If in moonlight, it keeps a quiet. Grain that sings when you plane it will keep company with you for years, Halen added. These remarks were practical and carrier of a certain warmth. The elder craft of living with things rather than merely using them. The night's repairs settled into a rhythm like song with verses. Hands moved in turn. Planing, stitching, pressing, rubbing with resin, test-fitting the rib of heartwood. The glow goblet at the gate was brought to life and hung at a lower notch so its light read the patch correctly from below. Little decisions accumulated, each modest, each important. The visible stitches on the veil grew in neat rows. The rib held the plank with a gentle firmness, and the traveler, having eaten and warmed, dozed in the mossed nook as if the house itself had tucked them into sleep. At one point, Sorel faltered. The middle row of stitches pulled slightly against the veil and puckered the leaf silk. She swallowed, embarrassed, and looked as if she would set the whole thing aside. Lirien placed a hand over hers and said simply, "A seam tells truth when it breathes." That was the teaching. One did not pretend a patch invisible if it did not sit right. Rather, one adjusted so it could breathe with the tree. Sorrel unpicked the row with methodical fingers and re-sewed, this time angling the thread to honor the way the leaf folded. The seam lay smooth and honest under the glow. The elder then offered a tale that hung like a benediction between the swish of a plane and the scratch of a needle. Long ago, Aaron said, when the treehouse had been younger and its planks brighter, a storm took a dozen shingles from the southern rim. The villagers had come and sown those gaps with bright, striped bark to say thank you to the tree. "We painted a child's name in the patch," Aaron murmured. Nobody hid that stitch. Later, when that child grew and found they were lost in the high fields of reed, they came home because they remembered the pattern of the patch. It taught them to read the place. The apprentices listened as if the story were a tactile thing, imagining themselves sewn into the map of the world. As the night advanced, the mist thickened, and the tree breathed deeper. The glow goblets carved small islands of gold where work could be done easily. Beyond them, the world softened into banks of dark green and a suggestion of far stars. The sap breath warmed the air near the inner chambers, and they paused to cup their hands around cups of herbal tea, drawing the heat in as though to anchor themselves. The traveler slept on, their breathing a small, even rhythm that the house accepted as a new part of its chorus. Yet something else required tending. When Halen test-fitted the rib and set the plank back in place, one end still wanted to lift where the ring deck met the branch. There was a faint, continuous motion that would catch a foot at daybreak if left. It was the sort of trouble that could be patched in the dark with a wedge and a whispered curse. Or it could be addressed in the careful light of dawn with measured cuts, and a new wedge shaped to hold seasonal swell. They weighed the options without fuss. Haste that might quicken a future break, or patience that would keep the board's story intact. Lirien listened to the night and then to her own hand against the plank. "We ride the tree's own breath," she said, voice low. "If we force it now, it will remember the force. If we let it settle and come with the morning, we teach it to rest with us. Which do you prefer?" Bram, who had felt the timbre of the wood beneath his fingers, answered without looking up. "We wait until dawn," he said. So the cut meets the grain when it is calm. Hush, Halen replied, smiling at the seriousness with which the boy had decided. Good. So they moved to secure the plank with a provisional tie of waxed cord, a temporary measure that would hold the plank from catching but not strain its breath. It was a line wrapped in a visible knot, an honest binding rather than a hidden fix. The cord lay across the grain like a promise, not strong enough to ordain a permanent solution, but enough to keep the night's sleep untroubled. There was an easy cheer in the room then, the sort of quiet satisfaction that comes from honest work well done. The apprentices exchanged glances as if to say, "We did this together. The house will wake whole." Mira poured a little more tea, and Elder Aaron thumbed the old hourstone until its worn face shone. As the mist folded and the treehouse breathed more slowly, the atmosphere rounded to something like contentment. Lirien moved between small domestic duties, smoothing the bark drape where it had been mended, making a space for the traveler to leave their cloak on the peg, touching each visible stitch as if to greet it. The face of each patch caught the glow and read back a new light. The running stitches on the veil shimmered like a braid of soft silver. The temporary cord on the plank sat with a frankness that made the room feel practiced, not patched. Night has a way of stretching thoughts sideways. Apprentices' minds drifted to their own small houses, to the secret stitches they had made as children, to the day they might one day be keeper. Bram imagined, briefly and with a rollicking mixture of fear and delight, a future where his own hands taught another's. Sorrel thought of how much more luminous the elderberries looked when set against the green of leaf silk, and made mental notes about dye ratios. Erin hummed a tune she had not sung since her daughter was small, and hummed it into the warm air, as if to anchor both herself and the traveler's sleep. At the edge of that contentment, a sound came from beneath the ladder that was not the footfall of a neighbor, nor the soft landing of a bird. It was the muffled, rhythmic beating of something like a messenger. No, not messenger, but a herald in the old sense. A small rap, repeated, steady, and then another. The ladder stirred. Lirien put down her cup and moved to answer again, catching the veil with fingers that understood the weight of openings in the night. At the foot of the ladder stood a figure they had not expected. A sap merchant by his manner, dressed in a coat of layered gutted leaves, patched with bright scraps from many walls. He bore a satchel of little vials and a box of thin, pale strips, samples of bast free from resin, whirls of young bark. His boots were damp with dew, and his hair had the smell of rain. He looked like someone who had spent the twilight hours in the low hollows, trading and gathering the village's small resources. "May I come up?" he asked, voice soft, not needing to ask for permission so much as for acknowledgement. He held up one hand, showing in it a small token, nothing more exotic than a carved shell, the kind the village sometimes used as exchange when coin did not fit the need. Lirien drew the veil aside and bared the glow to the ladder, a stretch of light like a safe berth. "You may," she said. "The house keeps room." He climbed with the careful respect of someone who knew the etiquette of bows. On reaching the rim, he paused to let his eyes adjust to the interior. He nodded, taking in the work, the patched veil, the temporary cord over the plank. Then he offered his satchel as an apology and a gift. "I carry gathered things," he said. "Sap that sings at first light. Strips that bend yet remember their straightness. I thought you might want some." The simple generosity passed across the bowl glow like a tide. Mira reached for a vial and uncorked it. The scent released was of sap warmed under sun, piquant and living. The traveler, no longer nameless, stirred at the edge of sleep, opening their eyes and, seeing the merchant, relaxed further, as if recognition had softened the line of the night. "Stay," Lirien said, as much to the merchant as to the night itself. "Stay and rest. We have bread." The merchant accepted, setting the satchel on the floor beside the box of oddments. He took a seat, drew his cloak tighter, and, with the small courtesy of someone who knows the rhythms of others, offered a fragment of his trade. An extra strip of cured bark that shimmered faintly with a moonmetal sheen along its edge. It would be useful in the morning for shaping the rib, he explained, and his knowledge of the low hollow weather might help decide whether the plank should be cut at dawn or later. A hush settled that was neither empty nor full. It was the hush of people who had done all they could for the night, and were now gathered to be part of each other's keeping. Lirien moved through them and laid a stone of resin to the edge of the plank, a small weight, while Bram checked the cord once more to ensure it would not chafe the wood when the tree moved. Moth curled into the merchant's open palm, accepting a scratch that the beast rewarded with a soft, rumbling purr. They spoke less now, more content to let the room's sounds weave the conversation. The needle peg's tiny rasp, the plane's soft shush, sap drop against rimboard, and outside the distant, slow rustle of leaves like a chorus tuning itself. The traveler slept on. The merchant hummed a low, tuneless song learned on some Elven trail, and the apprentices sat in the glow's pool like small figures in a picture of care. The obvious tasks of the evening, securing the plank, mending the veil, were in place but not complete. The visible stitch glowed, but needed the mid-row tightened at dawn so it would catch the early starlight without buckling. The rib needed its final shaving to avoid the faint lift at the ring deck when the sun pressed sap into the wood. There was, beneath the comfort, a patient sort of tension. The work must continue, but the night had taught them the wisdom of slow hands. Lirien turned at length to the traveler and the merchant, and said quietly, "We will sleep now. The house will keep you. Dawn brings decisions and sharp tools. Rest while the tree breathes us a gentler rhythm." They each made a small ritual of it. Halen smoothed his palm along the rimboard, as if to say good night to that plank. Bram tied the cord's final knot and tucked the end beneath a curl of resin so it would not chafe. Sorrel smoothed the stitched veil with a palm as mothers smooth a child's brow. Elder Aaron moved the hour stone to the glow's side and let its worn face drink the light. The glow goblets dimmed, the mist thickened a little, and the tree sighed with the contentment of an animal that had been fed. Lirien stood a moment longer under the patched veil. She heard the sap breath, first a slow, patient inhale, and then a softer, deeper exhale, and set her palm to the woven leaf, right where Sorrel's stitches had formed a neat, visible braid. The seam was warm with the gathered touch of many hands. She did not smooth the stitch away. Instead, she pressed into it gently, acknowledging the patch's honesty. "Keep well," she murmured to the house, to the stitches, to the people. "Keep us all." Beyond the rim, the canopy thickened into that peculiar hush where stars lean close to leaves. Somewhere, a faint owl called, and a moth beat itself against a leaf in slow frustration. All at once, the village below it seemed more than the set of small houses and intertwined branches. It felt like a living web whose strands were the very hands they had banded together. They settled then into that waiting which belongs to work unfinished. The traveler breathed evenly. The merchant turned his satchel to make room for tomorrow's trade. The apprentices, lying on moss beds near the glow, exchanged dreams about the day's little triumphs and the cuts they'd take at dawn. Lirien lingered as if the night might offer more counsel. She checked the glow goblets one last time and, with a small private gesture, cleared a smudge from the edge of the rim board so the light would fall cleanly on the visible stitch come morning. The house breathed. The stitches held. The plank slept under its cord. The tree, leaning into the night, gathered its breath and kept it. And Lirien, who had been motionless for a moment longer than any of them, let the last of her wakeful thoughts unfurl like a strip of silk before she rose to her own small bed. She had arranged, in the course of the evening, a community's work into a single neat plan. Finish the plank at dawn. Retension the seam. Teach Bram the final wedge shaping. Let Sorrel tie the last moonmetal ring with Erin's hand guiding the knot. But dawn was a long time away, and the night made its own demands. The sleep of the traveler, the merchant's stories left half-told, the tree's slow, indivisible metabolism. Lirien stepped into her small bed, which smelled of leaf and resin, and the faint perfume of so many human and not human encounters. She watched the starlight sift through the patched leaves and thought of visible stitches as stars themselves. Small, bright marks, each one a place where light found land and decided to stay. Outside, the mist gathered, and from within that mist came the faintest of sounds, a rhythm different from the sap breath. A distant calling, almost like someone attaching a small bell to the night. Lirien breathed a careful, measured breath that matched the tree's exhale, and let sleep pull her through its weave, attentive even to dreams where seams talked back and told secrets of old repairs. The bowl glow guttered and steadied. Someone, perhaps the merchant, perhaps Halen, moved to refill it for the small hours. Fingers reached for thread and paused. The house lived in that pause as much as in the action. Outside, the leaves took starlight and let it fall through the patched veil in a new pattern. The sleeping traveler turned, smiled, and resumed their even breathing. The temporary cord held. The visible stitch caught the gold of the glow and read back an honest, quiet light. They had begun, and they had not yet finished. The night would hold them until the first thinning of mist when the tree exhaled with the sun, and the rib would be finally shaped and the plank set to take the day. For now, beneath the stars filtering through leaves, in a house made of stitches and sap and the small charity of neighbors, they slept within a world they mended together. Dawn came as a slow thinning of the world, not as a clatter. The mist that had pooled in the hollows of the lower branches lifted in stages, the opaque bank unzipping into ribbed veils, and then into fine threads that the early sun could pass through. Inside the treehouse, the sap breath altered its measure. A slimmer inhale, a shorter exhale, as if the whole living thing prepared to meet light. Someone shifted on a moss bed, and the sound was a soft, private thing. Lirien uncurled, and let her hand rest against the warm rope of the woven leaf veil, feeling the faint give of sorrel's stitches before the seam was tensioned properly. She had slept with the image of stitches in her mind, and woke with them still steady, like small constellations to be tuned. Outside, the sky was the color of thinned elderberry. Not yet bright, but clear enough that the glow goblets on neighboring eaves read like scattered coins. The merchant rose first, pulling his cloak about his shoulders and opening a vial to warm a strip of sap between his palms. The scent unfurled. Pine and something sweeter. sap warmed to the point where its living sugar rose in a small, kindred cloud. He offered a draught to Bram, who accepted with the furtive eagerness of a young hand that wanted steadiness. Halen was already at the rim-board, checking the temporary cord with the practiced frown of someone who knew how small things could incline a plank to mischief. "Morning," Halen said without flourish, tapping the rib he had set the night before. The wood answered with a clean, low sound, as if it recognized his touch. Bram came over, rubbing sleep from his knuckles. In the younger boy's face lingered the openness of someone who had learned in dark hours and wanted to be better at every step. They unfastened the provisional waxed cord together, doing it as they had done countless small closures, one hand supporting, the other teasing the knot. The cord slipped free with a little sigh, and for a moment the plank gave a small welcome, settling back into the rim as if content to be seen. Halen lifted it and set it upon the banister for the final dressing. He drew from his satchel a small, flat plane, bark smoothed and with an edge that woke to the first scrape, and handed it to Bram. "This will do the shaping," he said. "Breathe along the grain with it. There's a rhythm to listen for." Bram held the plane as if it were a bird he feared to alarm. Halen steadied the board with one hand and placed Bram's hands where they would learn the right pressure. He did not take over so much as steer. The lesson was in correction rather than command. Bram pushed, and the plane sang a soft, consistent song. Shavings peeled off in thin, translucent ribbons that smelled faintly of sugar and old sap. They lay in a pale heap like confetti for the morning. Each pass wept a brighter grain, and Bram began to understand the voice Halen described. How sometimes the wood would offer a high, thin squeal indicating a catch, and sometimes a broad, fat sigh, meaning it accepted the shaping. While Bram worked, Lirien attended to the veil. Sorrel had risen and already sat with the running stitches spread before her like a combed hairline. The middle row needed the final tightening that would keep the seam breathing when the full sun warmed the leaves and pulled them taut. Lirien took up a length of waxed thread, smooth and dark, and showed Sorrel the final loop of finishing. How to draw the needle so the stitch sat proud but not puckered, how to let the thread slacken a breath so the seam could expand. "Let it take the light," Lirien murmured, "not as a trap, but as an invitation. The stitch is honest when it answers the day." Sorrel did as she was taught. Her fingers, now steadier from the night's rehearsal, guided the needle peg through the leaf silk. The thread caught the early sun in a way that changed its tone. The running lines looked less like repair and more like a banding of stars. 3 modest rows that read differently as the world shifted. In the glow of the bowl they had been silver. In the house's green shadow they were a darker braid. Now, under the first tide of dawn, they were thread that invited the eye. Elder Aaron, who moved as if time itself attended her steps with deference, sat on the low stool and watched the apprentices. She plucked another oddment from her box, a thin strip of moon metal, barely wider than a finger, and held it up so the light skimmed its surface. "When you set metal with wood," she said softly, "you make a grammar. The metal says to the wood, 'I will hold,' and the wood answers, 'I will bend.' The sentence is a small promise." Lirien nodded and said, "We honor both when we let each speak in its true voice." They debated, in the civil way of craftsmen, whether the final wedge should be a single piece of shaped heartwood or a layered inlay to allow for future swelling. Halen argued for a single rib, shaved to a taper that fit the plank like a tongue to a groove. The merchant offered a thin shim of bark metal that would breathe with the wood and reduce friction. Bram, shy now but bold with new confidence, suggested a shallow channel to allow the plank to find its own position. The talk was quiet because the stakes were gentle. Longevity over haste, a lifetime of small comfort rather than a quick, visible fix. The morning revealed other small things the night had hidden. Where the rune scribe of the neighboring boughs had once carved a child's mark, a moss colony had crept into the curve of the bark and softened the line, making the wood read like a map of soft hillocks. Mira knelt and tended that moss with a tiny brush, coaxing it back into patterns that would not confuse the eye when the house needed to be read at a glance. The merchant wandered to the glow goblet and, with the slow care of someone who understood liquids, poured a tincture of warmed sap along the joint where the plank would sit. A thin film to encourage the wood to slide before the final setting. It glimmered in the dawn like a small river. The actual act of replacement was a quiet choreography. Halen had Bram steady the rib in position. They used a wedge of heartwood shaved so precisely that it needed only a little tapping to seat. The tapping stone made a particular bright sound as it met the wedge, short and crisp, and the plank shifted into the final place with a soft, satisfied creak. Halen checked the alignment with his thumb, tracing the seam to see where the grain met. He called Bram in, and Bram, cheeks flushed with the modest heat of effort, took the tapping stone and delivered the last thoughtful taps. When he drew back, the plank lay true, and the slight lift that had threatened a footfall at daybreak was gone. There was gratitude in the small room that had nothing theatrical about it. Someone clapped a hand lightly on Bram's shoulder. Mira offered him another slice of moss bread spread with a bright smear of preserved elderberry. The fruit tasted brighter in the morning, each mouthful a reward an old teacher might give in lieu of riches. Bram smiled, uncertainly pleased, the sort of smile that meant this triumph would return home with him as a small, indestructible thing. Attention turned then to the moon-metal rings that would carry the veil true. They chose 3, 2 for balance and 1 for ornament, hammered thin against the small anvil that Elder Aaron kept for such moments. The hammer strokes were measured. Each ring sang a tone when struck, and the sound told them whether it had been too heavy or just right. They threaded the rings through the hem and set the veil on its posts, adjusting until the patch read well in the angle of the rising star. Lirien held the veil and watched how the morning made the elderberry dye glow, and how the visible stitches threw a faint shadow. "A seam that holds its own shadow is honest," she said. Sorrel's hands shook only a little as she tied the final knot. Aaron guided them, showing the loop that would not slip, the small tuck beneath the last coil that would keep the knot from catching on passing branches. When Sorrel finished, Lirien ran her palm over the seam as if to introduce herself, and the seam answered with a warmth that was hardly different from the warmth of human skin. They moved, as it happens in such places, from high craft to simpler courtesies. The traveler, stirred by the morning and the low hum of trade, woke and stretched like an animal, blinking at the light and then at the group assembled. He rose and thanked them in a manner that was polite but genuine. There was in his manner an intangible easing, the kind that comes when one has slept in a place that keeps its promises. He folded his cloak and offered the merchant a coin. No, not coin, but a carved shell token. And the merchant shook his head, declining with the amused manner of someone whose goods traded in trust as often as trade. "We are keepers of other things," Lirien said, when the token was offered and refused. "Keep your stories as you would a good tool. They serve you better when held light. They ate together. Simple bread, the preserved fruit, a small curd of root cheese that just stiffened properly in the slow warmth of the glow. And talk moved from the mechanical to the intimate in small steps. Bram told, in a rush of words, of his earlier fumblings with a blade and how Halen's hands had corrected him without a sharp word. Sorrel offered a small demonstration of a dye mix she had tried. Elderberry with a hint of green lichen to make a deeper shade. And the elders murmured approval. The merchant, for his part, shared the news of the low hollows. A season of good sap, a trade route that had widened, a request from a neighboring coppice for a mender who could teach their apprentices visible stitching. It was, by the measure of their lives, a small bounty. Before the final sealing of the plank, they performed a quiet test. Lirien fetched the thin bowl in which they kept a drop of cooled resin sap, warmed it at the glow, and smeared a hairline across the join where two timbers met. Then she asked Bram to tread the rim gently while Sorrel watched the seam. The board bowed in answer to Bram's weight and then settled back, the rib taking the pressure like a well-shaped support. Sorrel examined the seam and smiled, a small private triumph that had nothing to do with applause. "Leave the mark," Aaron advised, not to hide it but to commend it. "Let the house read like a book. Later, someone will see the 3 rows and know who mended it." They finished the last touches, the leather guard that Halen fixed to the plane's handle so Bram's palm would not blister in long hours, the small bead of moon metal hammered into the veil's lower corner, so that in breeze it would ring once and call the house like a name. Lirien, in a ceremony that was for her both private and public, wrapped Sorrel's fingers in a cloth and pressed to her the finger guard that had once belonged to her own teacher. "For patience," she said, "and for the patience to teach." Aaron then reached into her box and took out a small something that made the apprentice's eyes widen. A thin, shelled hourglass the size of a child's fist, whose sand was powdered pearl and green, so that when turned it showed a faint, starlit trickle. She gave it to Bram. "When your hands grow quick," she said, "let this remind you that haste breaks things. Turn it, and wait until the sand runs. If you can build your patience to that measure, you will mend well." There was a short, communal laugh at that, warm and wholly affectionate. Gifts in the treehouse tended to be functional, tools tuned to a hand, but they were also heavy with meaning, a guard that implied trust, an hourglass that implied a moral art. They took their places for the last act of ritual, relighting the glow goblet at the gate so the starlight would read the patched veil as intended. The glow goblet needed only a small flame and a breath, but the act was done like a benediction. Lirien cupped the wick of the goblet, and, with a steady hand, set it so that its light pooled like a clear coin on the steps. She adjusted the moss beneath it until the color returned to true green, rather than the washed tone that mist sometimes borrowed. When it shone, the veil threw its new pattern across the rim in a way that looked both deliberate and accidental, just as any honest seam should appear. Halen and the merchant stood on the rim and looked outward. The early sun had not yet risen high enough to dissolve all the silver of starlight. There was, for a pinch of time, an odd mixture of last night's stars with the first breath of day. The patch read itself against that double light. When the sun struck the elderberry dye, it warmed. When the starlight lingered, the fine threads gleamed. It was the kind of moment the village kept in its memory. A repair that made the house both stronger and stranger. A seam that sang different songs depending on which sky watched it. After the small ceremony, they shared the final breakfast in a more leisurely manner, as if they had earned a morning that could be savored. Conversation here proved instructive in small ways. Aaron described how to store dyed leaf silk, so it would not take the smell of smoke. Halen demonstrated the angle at which a plane should be sharpened to make shavings that curl rather than break. Mira explained the gentle way to coax moss to grow in patterns that would encourage water to run in desired directions. There was another small moment of teaching, private and exact. Lirien took Bram aside to the small shelf where she kept a ledger of odd little calls, names of apprentices, the dates of repairs, a scrap of poem, written in ink made from soot and lichen. She showed him where his name might one day be placed, along with a small mark for the rib he had shaped that morning. Write modestly, she advised. Let the mark tell the story. You need not add flourishes. Bram accepted, and with the merchant's small knife he scratched the tiniest of marks on a scrap of thin bark, which Aaron would keep in the village chest. This, too, was a craft. Record-keeping shaped as though it were another seam to be tended. As the sun rose fully, the treehouse exhaled in a longer, more certain line, and the plank settled with the warmth of day. The sap breath shortened in measure. Joints that had been slackened by night tightened with the sun's call. They stood for a while and simply listened, to the sound of the ring deck as it readjusted, to moth's contented purr, to the merchant humming a small chorus of a tune from the low hollows. It was not grand music, but it was enough to stitch the room's mood into a single seam. Before the final parting, Aaron drew the apprentices close and told another of her small tales, less instruction, and more the way a knitter might recount how a pattern learned in youth eased a broken thought years later. She spoke of a mender who had once used bright, garish strips to hide a patch instead of making a readable seam. Travelers were confused, she said, and so the chronicler of that time had taught the lessons of clarity. A visible stitch is also a civic map, she finished. It tells strangers which hands may be trusted. They took the caution as kindly as any counsel, and then turned to the work of departure. The traveler folded his moss blanket and left a warm thanks at the gate, promising to send word across the branches if he could. The merchant packed his satchel, fellow traders waiting at the low road, and handed to Lirien a small strip of cured bark with a moonmetal edge as an additional gift. For your next join, he said, smiling, so that your hands may always find a good tool. Lirien accepted the gift with the understated gratitude of someone who knew how tools command loyalty. She watched him descend the ladder, shadowed now by a sun that had done the morning its favors, and then she turned to her people and to the house. There were small tasks left, always. Ropes to retension later, resin to set, a pattern of moss to press into the inner sill so the rain would not creep where they did not want it. The day's work could have spread wide, but they chose, by a shared glance, to end on notes of gentle completion. They gathered again around the bowl glow, now less a practical lamp and more like a cup to hold the warmth of the morning. Words were quiet and full of unspoken thanks. Lirien moved through them, pressing a hand to Bram's shoulder and then to Sorrel's crown, each touch a blessing without edges. She turned to Aaron and inclined her head the way somebody who had learned from another long life might. The elder, for her part, made a small motion with the hour stone, and the apprentices understood. Keep time, keep care. Do not hurry the latter for the former. At the very end, when the last of the bread had been eaten and the merchant had already become a moving shape along the lower path, Lirien stood by the patched veil and performed her small private ritual. She brought out from a drawer a shell-shaped hourglass, different from the one Aaron had offered Bram. This one was larger and held a dusting of mica and ground leaf pollen. She turned it, marking for herself the measure of the day's end, and then she closed her eyes for a short moment. The room held its breath with her. Even Moth quieted, sensing the sanctity of the pause. She placed her palm against the visible stitch and listened, not with her ears so much as with the parts of her that had learned to hear wood speak. The house answered faintly, the way it always did. A long, small inhale as the tree drew water into its veins, a soft, patient exhale. Lirien breathed with it 3 times, each cycle taking less of her own will and more of the tree's tempo. The exercise was almost a prayer, though it remained wholly domestic. A measured sinking of breath to sap breath, so she might be ready to teach the cadence to others. There were things she did then that one could not easily put into a ledger. She brushed a fleck of resin from Sorrel's sleeve and tucked it into a pocket. She wound a thin thread of dyed bark into a coil and passed it to the apprentice as a mending gift. She secreted a small scrap of moon metal into Halen's toolkit, a token that would remind him of the morning's cooperation. These, too, were customs that held a village together. Before the final parting, Lirien spoke with the quiet invitation that had begun the night. "If your path leads you under these leaves again," she said to them all, "bring a story and a stitch." It was not a command as much as a soft keeping of an open door. Aaron, who had been watching the patched veil as if it were a small celestial body, offered the closing axiom in her terse, bell-like voice. "A home that is mended in view teaches every tongue the language of care," she said. "Make your mending speak clearly." The apprentices took that to heart. Bram, who had early in the dawn been uncertain whether his hands would obey him, now sat like someone who had a small secret. That skill grows in the repetition of kindness. Sorrel, whose eyes had caught the dye practice and the way light bent round the thread, fingered a small scrap of elderberry silk and thought of future patterns. Even the traveler, who now stood on the ladder and prepared to slip down to the path, carried away a small certainty that had less to do with where he was going and more to do with the fact that he had been kept. The treehouse, content with its tasks, seemed almost to hum approval. Leaves caught stray sun and turned it into a million small motes. The patched seam threw a shadow like the script of a tiny constellation. Lirien brushed a last finger along the running stitches and felt each tiny knot like the imprint of a blessing. She turned the shell hourglass back into its nest and set out a cup of tea for any who might drop in, an invitation to future hands. They dispersed, each taking with them a small piece of the morning. Bram walked down with Halen, clasping the small plane newly conditioned. Sorrel followed with a sample of dyed silk tucked in her satchel, fingers already forming new ideas. Mira tended her bundle of moss and sap as if it held future gardens. The merchant bowed and went on his way, lighter for the refrain of the treehouse's company. Aaron stayed a little longer, sweeping the scattered shavings into a neat pile and humming a tune that might have been a map. Lirien remained at the threshold until the last of their steps grew faint on the path. She touched the patch one more time with the same modest reverence she brought to the smallest rites, smoothing not to erase, but to honor. The veil swung gently in a surprise draft that threaded down from the leaves, and the sun sent a shard of bright light that slipped through the woven silk and painted a narrow column on the rim board. For an instant, the patch read like a small window, starlight and sunlight playing across the same thread. She hung the moth bell, the little moon metal charm that had once called the apprentice children to study, back on its peg, and, with a gesture almost shy in its intimacy, turned toward the inner chambers. There were the quiet leftovers, a spool to wind, a few shavings to sweep into an old sack, a bowl to wash. The domestic chores of conclusion were themselves a comfort, a daily liturgy. Before she stepped into the shadow of her sleeping shelf, Lirien performed a final, short-breathing practice she now taught to apprentices who asked for a private lesson. She called it sinking to the sap breath. She placed a palm to the rim board and counted the tree's inhalation in her mind. 1. Long, full. 2. Short, soft. 3. Longer and patient. She matched hers to that line and let the rhythm ease any tightness from her bones. This small exercise was nothing mystical. It was the simple agreement of body and wood. She turned the hands she had been given by the day back into the house's rhythm. The tree breathed. The house hummed. Starlight lingered in the striations of the new seam like a small chorus of bells. Lirien extinguished the bowl glow, carefully so as not to smear the residue, and set the glow goblet at the gate to low, its glow now a patient ember that would watch the night. She wandered through the rooms, touching each visible stitch the way one might touch a friend's shoulder in passing. At the end, when the last of the work had become memory, she stood for a long while beneath the canopy and watched the leaves take the changing light. The patch she had so often thought of now lay integrated, a part of the house's story rather than an interruption. A gentle satisfaction unrolled in her chest, not prideful, but like the fulfillment of a promise kept. The village, that woven community of hands, had once again rewritten a small page in its ledger of care. She thought, in that soft hour, of the future apprentices who might come to these branches, hands inexperienced, eyes bright, and felt the steady warmth of their possibility. She thought of how the visible stitches would teach them to read places as if they were books. She thought of how the traveler would maybe carry the image of the patched veil to another village, and tell that people could be trusted to mend what they used. Then, with the house settled and the day beginning to press its edges, Lirien made a small gesture linked more to habit than ritual. She set out a spare cup of tea on the outer step and left the ladder lowered a rung or two, an open invitation for any passer-by who might wish to pause. It was hospitality rendered as matter of fact. No fanfare, only a room left ready. She stood under the leaves a moment longer, feeling the sap breath move through her, and pressed her hand to the patched seam once more, as if to seal the morning with touch. If you have lingered beneath these leaves for this telling, Lirien would ask the same quiet favor she gives her guests. Stay a little longer in the memory of such nights until the details have found their place. Return, if you will, on another evening to watch a different seam be made, to hear another apprentice's small triumph. There are always stitches to read, always planks to shape, and always the soft music that happens when a house is kept by many hands. She turned at last to her bed, the sheet of folded boughs that smelled of resin and the mild perfume of the day's work. Moth leapt up beside her and settled into a crescent, warm and heavy. Lirien lay down and let the sap breath set the measure of her sleep. In the small dark, she thought of visible stitching as a constellation that translated human care into a language any traveler might follow. She felt the day's small rewards: Bram's proud silence, Sorrel's patient hand, the merchant's bright strip, settle like a shawl across her shoulders. Outside, the leaves let starlight through in the familiar pattern that had begun it all, now filtered by the added braid of morning and the careful seam that caught a new kind of light. The treehouse exhaled once more, slow and vast, content with the day's keeping. Lirien closed her eyes and allowed a last peal of gratitude for her people and their hands to be the last thought before sleep took her. When morning next softened to afternoon, someone would notice where the repaired seam threw a different shadow and smile. In the months that would follow, a child would point to the 3 rows of visible stitches and ask who had made them, and an elder would tell a story that turned the repair into a map. That, perhaps, was the clearest evidence of success. Not that something had been fixed, but that the fix became part of the place's telling. If this evening beneath the leaves has warmed you, and you would like more nights of the treehouse, more small ceremonies of mending, more lessons in patience and craft, return when you can. There are always stories to be told and hands to teach. The ladder will remain lowered a notch for those who wish to climb. Lirien breathed with the tree one last time before sleep unspooled her. The patched veil swung faintly, tracing a slow, private arc, as starlight threaded the leaves, and the sun washed the seam with its first full warmth. The house breathed. The visible stitches shone. The village kept its promise. Under the canopy, where sap met sky, the Elven Treehouse settled into a steady, generous hush. Starlight through the leaves, held together by careful hands, and the quiet covenant of neighbors who mend in view.